This is Generous Theology, and today Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Professor Black's work in Chapter 23, The Nature of Intellect, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Happy Reformation Sunday to you, my friend. And if it's okay to just take a look at this interesting section, we are following up in Chapter 23, The Nature of Intellect, by Deborah L. Black. And we talked about building the modern model on the foundation of Plato and Aristotle, broadly considered. And so that is to say, just like when you play ice hockey and you're on the ice, if you have nothing to push against, it's sometimes difficult to actually move when you're on a frictionless surface. So too, when you're thinking about history, unless you maybe have something to compare a certain time period with, if that time period's not very familiar to you, it can be hard to just read about it in the abstract and have it make sense. So we talked about building an understanding of that system by considering this Platonic, this Aristotelian backstory. Of course, those movements have grown through time to include the church. Think of the Augustinian tradition here to a large degree being affected by these. And now we're in the Middle Ages. It's fair to now consider what is one of the most interesting aspects of Middle Ages thought, and that is the impact and influence of the thinkers from Islam on Judaism, on Christianity, and it's quite substantial. And I think maybe before I read this chapter, I understood that the impact was substantial, but I maybe didn't have a lot of grounding into how that specifically worked out. And so we might be talking about a time period and a philosophy that is largely distant from at least my own Reformed understanding. So all that's just a setup to say this is an interesting chapter and interesting sections. I think we can assess a lot of it, though, by relation. So we talked about the backdrop, but also we're going to talk about how Deborah Black portrays this with respect to what's coming in the Middle Ages after these Islamic influences. And so with that in mind, we can delve into some of this. How was it for you reading about the Islamic thinkers, some of their thoughts here? Did you have any introduction with this prior? Did you have any thoughts or build out, let's say, of some of what the history of that influence has added and affected us in the West?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously one of the threads that seems to draw through a lot of the chapters we've been reading is how important Avicenna and Averroes especially have been in thinking about where did medieval philosophy go, especially in terms of interpreting and understanding Aristotle, as opposed to the Neoplatonism or Platonism that had been more powerful in Western thought prior. And that thread continues to draw very strongly through this chapter as well. In thinking about the nature of the intellect, so much of where Deborah Black takes us, and even as she then brings us into medieval Christian philosophy, so much of it is really filtered through Avicenna and Averroes. One chapter I don't think we necessarily walked through together, but was some of the origin stuff early on as well. And there was a sense in reading that chapter as well. I had this general concept, which I think a lot of people do, that we know that to some extent we have this sort of idea that there was a Dark Ages in Western Europe, and a lot of learning went by the boards for a while, and much of ancient knowledge was preserved through the Arabs and through Muslim thinking, and that it came to Europe often because of the Islamic conquest and then osmosis from there, in addition to some of the other ways that it was preserved by monk friars and some of these in these places that are isolated throughout Europe. But you really don't, even that narrative doesn't really make it as clear as how important some very specific ways of thinking really came to fruition in the West. And so much of the way that later medieval thinkers thought about so many of these issues, about the nature of the intellect or soul's faculties, looking back, soul and body, looking back, or looking forward to the next few chapters and thinking about perception and mental representation. So much of the Aristotelian framework really did flow through these Muslim thinkers. And then you mentioned, of course, some Jewish thinkers as well. And I think anyone who has done a little bit of studying in medieval thinking has heard of people like Maimonides, what was another one that was named here, Levi ben Gershom, Simonides. You hear about those people, but you don't necessarily understand how important they were. And I think that there is a sense, and I know this maybe goes a little bit away from the actual content of what we're talking about in this chapter, but there is a sense to me, and we've talked about this a little bit, where modern thinkers have sometimes criticized what came before, whether it's medieval or even just prior to the Enlightenment or even early Enlightenment thinking, as being just the product of the West, just the product of Christianity, and just the product of a very small number of thinkers and people. And if we're truthful about that, that's just not the case. That there really was a very complex and worldwide, or at least much of the world system that played into the way the Western thinkers ended up into the ways that they were thinking. So much of this did come through places like the Middle East and further east because of Islam, and in North Africa, both because of Christians and Jews and later Muslims as well. And so there is this sort of prejudice that we have that the Western canon or Western ways of thinking is really only about a small time and a small place, a small number of people, isn't necessarily true. And I'm not going to say that we should not also think about other thinkers in other parts of the world, but there is really a lot more to even medieval thinking. It's much more cosmopolitan than I think maybe a lot of people give it credit for, which makes it, I think, worth studying, even to see some of those threads and how do they play, and even where we may come to very different conclusions. It's worth seeing those threads and how they play through and where they end. Yeah, it is very interesting, and there is a sense in which, these Islamic thinkers have had a great impact on Christian thought during this era.
Amen. I think one of the things that is also interesting here is to consider just what an upheaval the Islamic intellectual tradition represents. Perhaps we are not used to the kind of upheaval that the Eastern Mediterranean region went through when the Greek world, that was founded largely in the wake of Alexander the Great's unifying conquest in the 4th century BC, that Greek world had a provenance and history of about 1,000 years. And then along came the Islamic Revolution, jihad. And of course, not instantly, but at an amazing clip, that 1,000-year culture was revolutionized and changed. And almost overnight, in a sort of cultural war type situation. And that made me really pause to think, because the Greek world perhaps seemed the most cultured and the most sophisticated part of the Western known world at that time. So if you take Europe, Africa, and the western part of Asia, the Middle East, with its Greek Hellenized culture centered in Constantinople and Alexandria, really represented sort of the pinnacle or the high point of Western civilization and culture. And then all of a sudden, in just a short 100 years, 150 years or so, the Islamic Revolution was upon them, and things changed on a cultural scale almost overnight. And that really gives me cause for pause, especially as we're in what some have called, and I've used the phrase as well, of course, the culture wars. And is that the fate of sophisticated cultures, to be highly developed only to be plowed under in favor of the next thing, the next gig, the next step forward in the human experiment? And that's a little bit controversial, and it's a little bit out of the chapter text that Black gives us here, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, on how does that affect how we live here in a place where maybe the culture wars. Until recently, it seemed like we're really largely going one way. And then in recent years, there's been such an upheaval and such a plowing under of old established traditions, norms, thoughts, values in favor of new things. Are we experiencing, for lack of a better term, and I'm also being a little bit controversial here, are we experiencing a secular jihad here in the Christian West? And is something else coming along, just as Islam came along to take over and dominate what had previously been the Greek world and the Jewish world of that Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East?